I went on that hunting trip in late October of 2018, a few weeks after my 29th birthday. I had been working long hours at a warehouse outside Cleveland, and my head felt crowded all the time. I wanted a break from people and noise, so I picked a spot in northern Michigan, close to the Huron National Forest. I had been there only once before, years ago, and I remembered it being quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself pressed down on you. I drove up on a Friday morning, packed with my usual gear. A basic tent, a small stove, a sleeping bag that had lost some warmth over the years, and my hunting rifle. The last few miles were slow because the dirt road had collapsed in sections from the summer storms. The forest looked different from what I remembered. The trees leaned inward more, their branches bare except for the stubborn brown leaves that hadn't fallen yet. It felt like everything was waiting for winter and holding its breath. I parked near a clearing big enough for a tent and a small fire pit. There were no other cars, no people, not even an old trail marker. It felt like the forest had been forgotten. The quiet was thick. Even the wind moved slowly through the branches, like it was tired. I set up camp before the sun dipped behind the trees. The air cooled fast, and the earth smelled like wet leaves and old wood. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal, sat by the fire, and watched the flames roll and snap in the darkness. I fell asleep early, not thinking about anything except how cold my feet were. The next morning, everything felt still. There were no birds, no rustling, nothing. Usually mornings in the forest have some kind of movement, even if it's weak. I walked a few hundred yards from camp, studying the ground for tracks. I found a few deer prints heading northwest, so I followed them deeper into the woods. The forest got denser, the branches lower, the air colder. My breath came out like thin smoke. I walked for almost 2 hours, stopping every few minutes to listen. The quiet felt wrong. Even when I shifted my weight, the leaves barely made any sound. It was like they were wet from something other than rain. Eventually, I saw an open space ahead. It wasn't large, just a small break in the trees. In the middle of it, there was something strange on the ground. I thought it was a log at first, but as I moved closer, I saw it was actually a pile of fur. Deer fur, a full body's worth of it, but no meat, no bones, nothing else. It was arranged in a circle, like something had peeled the animal clean and then laid the fur out neatly. My stomach tightened. It didn't look like a kill from wolves or coyotes. Predators usually left chaos, drag marks, blood, scattered pieces. This was too clean, too deliberate. I scanned the tree line, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. There was nothing there. No noise, no tracks around the fur pile, no scent of blood. I backed away and decided to head toward camp, walking slower this time, listening harder. Halfway back, I heard something behind me. Not a growl, not footsteps, just a slight, sharp crack, like a small branch breaking under pressure. I froze. The sound didn't repeat. I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there with the cold air in my lungs, letting my heartbeat slow a little. When I finally turned, I saw only trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe just a branch shifting from old age. I continued toward camp, but the feeling didn't go away. It followed me like a heavy coat on my back. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, and I could hear leaves sliding across the ground in thin waves. I stayed near the fire, sharpening my knife, checking my rifle, trying to act like everything was normal. But the image of that clean circle of fur stayed in my head. When night came, the temperature dropped hard. It felt like the cold pushed itself into the tent even before I lay down. I woke up sometime around midnight, breath tight in my chest. I didn't know what woke me at first. Then I heard it, something moving outside. Not footsteps, more like a slow drag across the dirt, then a pause, then another drag. The sound was soft but close. I stayed still, my hands gripping the sleeping bag tight. My tent walls looked thin under the moonlight. The dragging sound circled halfway around the tent and then stopped. The silence after it felt heavier than the noise itself. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 minutes. When the sound didn't return, I forced myself to breathe evenly and eventually drifted back to sleep. In the morning, frost coated everything. The ground was stiff and white except for a long, narrow mark that cut across the dirt near my tent. It wasn't a footprint. It looked like something heavy had been pulled, but there were no tracks beside it. No boot prints. No animal prints. Nothing. The mark stopped a few feet from my tent door. I stared at it for a long time. The cold air bit at my hands and face, but I barely felt it. I knew something was wrong, and every part of me wanted to pack up and leave. But I told myself I came for peace, for quiet, for hunting. I convinced myself the mark was from a branch that fell and got dragged by the wind, even though the line was too straight and too clean for that. Still, I carried my rifle the entire day, even when I walked down to the stream for water. The trees seemed closer than they had the day before. The forest felt like it was watching me. That afternoon, I decided to check the area where I had seen the deer fur. When I returned to the clearing, the fur was gone. Every strand. The ground looked disturbed, but not in a messy way. It looked swept. That was when the cold in my chest turned into something sharp, something alert, something telling me I wasn't supposed to be here. I walked back faster than I should have, breathing hard even though the air was thin. When night came, the wind died, and the forest went silent again. I sat in the tent for a long time before lying down. I kept my boots on. My rifle rested next to me. My flashlight lay across my stomach. Couldn't relax. My body felt tight and wired, like it was preparing for something I couldn't see. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The dragging. Slow, careful, closer than the night before. I could hear it pulling across the leaves, then across the dirt, then stopping just outside the tent. My heartbeat felt so loud I thought it would give me away. The dragging stopped. Then I heard breathing. Not animal breathing. Not the deep, heavy kind. This was slow, steady, almost human. Too controlled. I felt the shape of the tent wall move inward slightly, like something was leaning close. The cold air outside pressed against the fabric, pushing it an inch or two toward me. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My chest burned from holding my breath. The breathing lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then it stopped. I waited for footsteps or movement, but there was only silence. I didn't sleep at all after that. I watched the tent fabric until the first thin line of light came in from the edge of dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see the ground, I stepped out. The dirt around the tent was disturbed in a long, smooth arc, like something had crouched low and moved around me slowly. There were no footprints, no paw prints. The ground looked brushed clean. I didn't bother making breakfast. I didn't take down the tent properly. I ripped the stakes out, tossed everything into the car, and slammed the doors shut. The forest felt tighter than ever, like it was leaning in. As I drove away, I saw something in the rearview mirror, standing between the trees where my campsite had been. I couldn't make out its shape clearly. It looked tall and still, like a person or maybe a tree that hadn't been there before. I blinked, and the shape blended into the shadows. I kept driving until the forest thinned and the road opened to paved ground. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station over an hour away. When I got out of the car, my legs shook so hard I had to lean on the door. I never went back to that forest. I never hunted alone again. I still don't know what moved around my tent those nights. I don't know what stripped that deer clean or brushed the ground smooth. But I know it wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was something real, something alive, something that knew I was there, and it wanted me to know it too. I had planned the trip for months, thinking a few days alone in the hills of northern Wales would clear my head. Work had been eating at me for a long time, and the idea of quiet forests, steady rain, and nothing to worry about except keeping the fire alive felt like something I needed. I drove out there in late October of 2017, at a time when the weather was cold enough to numb my fingers but not cold enough to be dangerous. I was 26 back then, still thinking I understood the outdoors well enough to handle anything it threw at me. The place I chose wasn't a campground. It was a secluded stretch of land near an old logging area that hadn't been used in years. The track leading there was narrow, muddy, and almost invisible from the main road. I had found it through a forum where people shared quiet spots to camp if they wanted no company. That was exactly what I wanted. I didn't want anyone walking past, no dogs running up, no cars pulling in during the night. Just me, my tent, and the sound of rain against the trees. It had been raining since morning, the kind of rain that doesn't hit hard at once but settles into every part of your clothes and gear. By the time I reached the spot, the ground was soft, almost sponge-like, and every step made a heavy squelch. I picked a flat patch near a low ridge covered with thick shrubs. It seemed safe enough. No big branches above me, no rushing water close enough to flood me out. I pitched my tent slowly, checking the lines twice because I could feel the wind changing direction every few minutes. When the tent was finally up, I set everything inside. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, strong enough to taste at times. I laid my sleeping bag out, placed my small stove near the door flap, and started heating a simple meal. The rain pattered harder on the tent roof, steady and rhythmic. It was calming. I remember thinking I'd sleep deeply that night. I didn't. Even before anything strange happened, something felt off. It was subtle at first. The air had a stillness that didn't match the moving rain or the shifting wind. The woods around me weren't making the usual sounds. No rustling from small animals, no distant bird calls. Just rain and the low hum of wind pushing through thicker branches somewhere higher up the ridge. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself the animals were probably sheltered or asleep. Hours passed. The light faded early because of the storm clouds, and soon all I could see outside was a deep gray darkness. I checked my watch often without meaning to. The numbers glowed softly, showing the time crawl from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The rain grew heavier, and the wind shifted so sharply that the tent pushed inward in long, slow breaths. The fabric groaned and snapped with every gust. Around that time, I felt the first jolt of unease. Came from nowhere, just a sudden sense that something wasn't right outside. Not something supernatural, just something real, something that had weight, shape, and intention. I listened carefully, pressing my ear against the inside wall of the tent. The rain made it hard to pick out anything specific, but after a minute or two, I thought I heard something like a wet footstep. Soft, slow, deliberate. I held my breath and waited for another one, but nothing came. The rain covered everything again. I tried to relax, telling myself it was probably a branch falling or water hitting the ground in a heavier spot. I went back to lying down, but the sense lingered. I could feel something in the air, like the pressure had shifted around me. An hour later, when the rain had slowed slightly, I heard it again, this time clearer. A single step, heavier than before, as if someone or something had shifted their weight in soaked shoes. Then another, not fast or stumbling. Slow, steady, almost careful. The steps stopped near the back of my tent. I stared toward that part of the fabric, even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The worst part wasn't the sound, but the silence that came right after. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It felt like someone was standing just outside, waiting, listening, thinking. The air inside the tent felt hotter and tighter, even though the night was cold. I stayed completely still, too scared to move even an inch. I tried to remember if I had locked my car, if the keys were buried somewhere in my backpack, if I would be able to grab anything fast enough if I needed to get out. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually the steps moved again, but this time they went around the tent, slow enough that I could follow them mentally as they circled me. The wet ground squished under each step. The sound moved from the back to the right side, then toward the front, then stopped near the entrance. I didn't know if the person, or whatever it was looking at the zipper or leaned down close to it. I could only imagine worst-case scenarios. The steps retreated a little after that, just a few paces, then nothing again. I stayed awake, staring at the roof of the tent, my whole body stiff. The rain picked up again, drowning out everything else. At some point, I must have drifted into a half-sleep, the kind where you're aware of everything but too exhausted to react. That was when I heard something new, a dragging sound, slow, rough, scraping against wet earth. It moved from somewhere beyond the ridge, down toward where my tent sat. Not fast, not like an animal running, more like something heavy being pulled by someone with limited strength. The dragging continued for several minutes, always pausing, then starting again. My imagination started filling in the blanks, but the sound was too real to ignore. When the dragging finally stopped, I felt another shift in the air, a faint vibration, a presence close enough that I could sense it even without sound. I felt the hair on my arms rise as if electricity had brushed over me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think clearly. I felt trapped inside that thin layer of fabric separating me from whoever, or whatever, was outside. For a long time, nothing else happened. No more dragging, no more steps. Just rain again and the dull ache of my body locked in fear. Slowly, the exhaustion won. I didn't fall asleep exactly, but my mind drifted in and out until a thin gray light finally filtered through the tent fabric. Dawn. I had never felt so grateful for daylight in my life. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hands trembling so much I struggled with the pull. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me sharply. Everything was slick with rain. Mud covered nearly the entire clearing. The ridge looked the same as the night before, but the ground around my tent wasn't. There were depressions in the mud, large, deep, spaced like footsteps, but not clean enough to show detail. Whoever walked around my tent had been standing in soaked earth for long enough that the prints had pooled with water. I followed the trail a few steps before stopping myself. The dragging marks were real, cutting long straight lines down from the ridge toward the trees. Something heavy had been pulled there recently. The marks continued deeper into the woods, too far for me to see the end without pushing through thick growth. I didn't go look. I didn't need to. I packed my things in minutes, faster than I ever had before. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone watching me from behind a tree or standing on the ridge. But the woods stayed still, completely silent. When I finally reached my car, I threw everything inside without caring how it landed. The moment the engine started, I felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly made me dizzy. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone until years later. But I know what I heard, and I know I wasn't alone out there. The most unsettling part is that I still don't know what the dragging sound belonged to, or why someone was walking circles around my tent in the middle of a storm in a place no normal person would be wandering at night. But I know this: I never camp alone anymore, and I never will again. Whatever was out there that rainy night had been watching me long before I ever realized it. I was 32 years old in the summer of 2019, and I remember that month in almost painful detail. I had taken a week off from my job in Dublin and flown to northern Norway for a solo camping trip. I told myself it was to clear my head. My mind felt heavy back then, like something thick and cold sat behind my eyes every time I woke up. I chose a remote area near a long, narrow valley surrounded by cold rivers and pine forests. The air was fresh in a way I wasn't used to, and the silence felt like it was pressing into my ears. I reached the campsite after a long hike on the first day. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat piece of earth near a slow river with a few rocks and fallen logs around it. The place was empty. I didn't see a single person during the entire trek, and I liked that at first. It made everything feel simple. I set up my tent, unpacked my small camping stove, and checked my map twice to confirm I wasn't too close to the bear-dense areas people online always warned about. The sun didn't fully set that night. Northern summer light has this strange quality where everything looks tired but still awake, and it messes with your sense of time. I stayed outside until my arms felt cold, then climbed into my sleeping bag. The river made quiet, bubbling sounds, and the wind in the trees had a deep tone that reminded me of the hum of an airplane cabin. I drifted off quickly. Early in the morning, while the air was still blue and heavy, I woke up to a faint cracking noise. It came from somewhere behind my tent. I lay still, listening with my chest tight. I told myself it was probably a small animal stepping on a branch. The forest is full of things moving all the time, but the sound repeated, slow and deliberate, like someone stepping on wood and then waiting before taking the next step. I stayed completely still, breathing through my nose so quietly that my throat hurt. After a minute or two, the noise faded and everything became calm again. I didn't get out of the tent. I just lay there, staring at the roof of it, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. When morning fully arrived, I stepped outside and looked around the area. Nothing seemed out of place. The ground had the same thin layer of pine needles. The river flowed the same way. I told myself it must have been a deer. The second day went smoothly. I hiked along the river, took some photos, and returned before the air grew cold. I cooked a small meal and stood by the water until the late light painted everything orange. For a while, I felt peaceful. But peace never lasts long when something strange is nearby, even if you don't realize it at the time. That night, I fell asleep quickly again. But something dragged me out of sleep, this time a dull thud, like something heavy landing on the ground or leaning against a tree. I lay completely still once more. Then came another sound. Not a crack this time, but a kind of slow scrape. It reminded me of a boot dragging against rough earth. My mouth went dry, and my whole body tensed as if my muscles were trying to shrink into my bones. The scrape happened again and then again at uneven intervals. It came from the direction of the river, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals move with more energy, more unpredictability. This sounded like something heavier, slower, and more controlled. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but the part of my brain responsible for survival forced me to stay put. I just listened, every nerve open, until the sound stopped. After that, I didn't sleep. I waited, lying awake until the pale morning light came through the fabric of the tent. When I stepped outside, my stomach tightened instantly. The ground near the riverbank had marks on it. Not footprints, just disrupted earth like something had dragged through the dirt in a long line. A narrow path of disturbed soil stretched from the edge of the water toward the trees. It was subtle enough that someone inexperienced might not have noticed, but I had hiked enough to recognize when something had been moved recently. The marks weren't natural. They were too straight, too focused. I had a strange sense that something had been watching me while I slept, even though I knew that wasn't rational. But fear isn't rational. It just exists like cold water. I spent the day hiking more cautiously. I kept turning around, scanning the trees, checking for movement. I didn't see anyone. Not a single hiker, not a fisherman, not even a passing boat on the river. The emptiness felt heavier than before, more like a thick fog in my head instead of peaceful isolation. By the time the sun dipped again into that half-sleep light, I felt drained. I ate quickly and crawled into my tent earlier than usual. Every small sound outside made my breath stop. I tried to hold on to logical thoughts, trying to reason that nothing truly dangerous was out there. But logic felt useless. When I finally slept, it didn't last long. I woke to the sound of something brushing directly against my tent wall. A light touch, like a hand dragging across the fabric. The tent flexed inward by a few centimeters. My skin felt like it turned to ice. The touch moved from one side of the tent to the other, slow and steady. My breathing turned shaky and shallow. I didn't move, couldn't. The thin fabric separating me from whatever was outside felt like nothing. My mind played through every possible explanation. An animal sniffing the tent, a strong gust of wind, a branch falling. But none of those matched the controlled way the pressure moved along the wall. Then it stopped. I heard breathing, very faint but unmistakable. Slow, steady, human breathing just outside the tent. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my fingers. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20. I couldn't tell. Time felt broken. Then it faded, replaced by soft footsteps moving away toward the trees. I stayed frozen for nearly an hour, barely blinking. When the first light touched the tent roof, I unzipped it and stepped outside with trembling legs. The ground around the tent had prints. Not clear footprints, but soft depressions in the dirt where someone or something had stood. The pattern was too wide for a small animal and too human-shaped to mistake for anything else. My throat tightened as if someone pressed a fist against it. I packed everything in less than 5 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't check the river, didn't look around for long. I only kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting a figure to step out. The hike back felt endless. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the flap of a bird's wings, made me jerk my head around. I kept imagining someone walking behind me, just out of sight. My backpack felt too heavy, and my legs felt stiff, like they didn't belong to me. When I finally reached the road where I'd left the rental car, my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to fit the key into the lock. I drove back to the small town where I had booked a cheap room, and only when I closed the door behind me did I let my body loosen. That night, I lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was safe. The lock was strong. The walls were solid. But my mind stayed stuck on the soft breathing outside the tent, the slow drag of a hand across the fabric, the heavy footsteps that had wandered around me in the dark. I realized something very simple but very clear. Someone had been out there with me. Someone who didn't speak, didn't reveal themselves, didn't come close enough to be seen. Just close enough to let me know they were there. I left Norway the next morning. I didn't finish the trip. I didn't go on another camping trip for years. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I feel the same cold pressure on my skin, like the memory still has weight. The ending is clear in my mind. I survived because I woke up, listened, and left. Whoever was out there wasn't interested in talking or being seen. They were interested in coming close, watching, and waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, and the scariest part is realizing that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the middle of quiet wilderness isn't an animal or a storm or some impossible creature. It's a person who shouldn't be there. And someone like that was there with me. I had been traveling through the south of France in late September of 2018, trying to get a break from my normal life. I was 27 then, tired from work and tired from the noise of the city. I thought a few quiet nights alone would help clear my head. I drove toward a national forest area outside a small town called St. Colnet, a place most tourists never even notice on maps. It was far from the big cities, and the roads leading there were narrow and old, almost swallowed by trees on both sides. I liked how isolated it felt. I thought isolation was what I needed. By late afternoon, I reached a flat area hidden behind a curve in the forest road. It wasn't an official campsite, but people clearly used it from time to time, because there was a small fire ring made from stones and a patch of dirt wide enough to fit a car. Tall pines surrounded the clearing, and the air smelled damp but clean. There were no houses, no farms, no signs of life anywhere nearby. I pitched my small gray tent close to the trees, set up my sleeping bag, put my food inside a metal container, and tried to settle in. The temperature was cooler than I expected, but I liked the bite of the air. The first night was quiet. I heard nothing but wind scraping through branches and the occasional crack of a twig in the distance. I slept early but woke up several times. I blamed it on the cold. I didn't think about anything strange. Not yet. The next morning, mist hung low between the trees. It felt like the forest was hiding something behind a white curtain. I walked around the area, following a small animal trail that split off the main road. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles and half-rotten leaves. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something odd. Footprints. They were faint, almost erased by the damp ground, but they were clearly human. They weren't large, maybe the size of a small woman's shoes, but barefoot. Barefoot prints in the cold forest. That made no sense. I stood over them for a while, trying to decide if they were recent or old. The edges looked soft, not yet filled with fallen needles. I told myself they had probably been made earlier that morning by some hiker who didn't care about their own comfort. I walked back to my campsite without taking the trail any further. Something about it bothered me more than it should have. I tried to shake it off. I forced myself to make a small fire, heat water for coffee, and focus on normal tasks. The day passed slowly. I didn't see anyone else. No hikers, no cars. No sign that anyone even knew this place existed. By late afternoon, the sun started dropping behind the trees, and the shadows stretched out like long, dark arms. I felt a bit uneasy, but I told myself it was because I had been alone too long. When darkness finally took over the forest, it felt thicker than normal darkness, the kind that presses on your skin. That night, I woke up at some unknown hour when I heard something outside my tent. It wasn't an animal moving around. It was softer, slower, almost human-like. I lay still, listening to my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I tried to breathe quietly. The sound moved very slowly, like someone walking but dragging their feet slightly. The steps circled the left side of my tent, then moved behind it. I wanted to convince myself it was a deer, maybe even a boar, but the steps were too light, too deliberate. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I waited until the sound faded into the trees. I didn't sleep again. When morning finally came, it felt like I had been awake for days. I got out of the tent and looked around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed something near the fire ring. A single long strand of dark hair. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't from any animal I knew. It looked too clean, too smooth. I felt a cold tightness in my stomach. I tried to tell myself maybe it had been there before, but I had cleaned that area the day I arrived. I was sure of it. I spent the rest of the morning debating whether I should pack up and leave. Part of me felt stupid for wanting to run over something so small. The other part of me remembered the sound of those slow steps in the dark. I decided to stay one more night, mostly because I didn't want to feel like fear could control me. That decision would follow me. The day dragged on uneasily. Every little sound made me turn my head. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, like things were holding their breath. That evening, clouds rolled in fast, thick and heavy. Rain began to fall not long after I crawled into my tent. The drops hit the fabric in steady, sharp taps. It made it hard to hear anything else, which somehow made me even more tense. I rested on my back, staring at the roof of the tent, telling myself I would leave first thing in the morning. Sometime deep into the night, I woke again. Not because of a sound, but because of a feeling, like something was close, too close. I stayed still for a moment, listening, and then I heard it, footsteps again. Slow, dragging. They came from the same direction as before, but this time they stopped directly in front of my tent door. The rain muffled everything, but I could still make out the faint scrape of something against the ground. I didn't move. My hands were cold even inside the sleeping bag. I felt the hair on my arms rise. Then I saw it, a shadow. A human-shaped shadow pressed faintly through the thin fabric of the tent as lightning flashed somewhere far away. The silhouette was small, thin, and still. The person, whoever it was, stood only a few feet from me. They didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything. They just stood there in the rain, staring at my tent. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only minutes. Eventually, the shadow shifted. The figure stepped back, slowly, like they were gliding rather than walking. Then the steps faded into the rain again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the gray morning light finally came, I got out of the tent immediately. The first thing I noticed was the ground. There were footprints in the mud leading straight toward my tent. Small footprints.
Bare.
The toes were thin and long, and the heels dug slightly deeper into the earth. They stopped just a foot away from where I had slept. Then they turned and disappeared into the woods. I packed my things fast, stuffing everything into my backpack without caring about order. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my stove twice. I didn't even bother to eat. I just wanted to get to my car and leave. But before I left the clearing, I saw something in the trees about 20 meters away. A woman. She was standing among the pines, half hidden behind a trunk. She wore soaked, dirty clothes that clung to her thin frame. Her long black hair hung over her face, dripping water onto her shoulders. Her posture was strange, too still, almost stiff. She didn't come closer. She didn't run away either. She just watched me, like she had been watching me the whole time. Her eyes, the only part of her face clearly visible, were wide and dark. Not angry, not sad, just empty. Empty in a way that made something inside my chest shrink. I didn't wait to see if she would move. I got into my car, locked the doors immediately, and drove faster than I probably should have on a narrow road. I kept checking the rearview mirror until the forest was completely gone. I never went back to that part of France. I never found an explanation. No missing person reports, no strange local stories. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I know someone had been walking barefoot around my tent in the middle of the night. I know someone had been standing close enough to touch the fabric. And I know that on that final morning, a woman was watching me from the trees with the kind of empty stare I will never forget. I don't camp alone anymore. And every time I think about those small footprints in the mud leading right up to where I slept, I feel that same cold tightness in my stomach again, because I still don't know how long she had been there before I noticed, or what she wanted, or how close she came while I slept through the night. I never planned to camp alone that summer. I was 24, tired from working long hours at a warehouse in northern Alberta, and all I wanted was a long weekend in the quiet. I kept telling myself I needed a break from everything: noise, lights, people, stress. I borrowed my cousin's old pickup and drove out to a place he had mentioned once, a small backcountry area near the Athabasca River. It wasn't a marked campground, not even close. It was just a quiet patch of forest that people sometimes used when they wanted to be by themselves. I reached it early in the evening, around 6. The sun was still up, low and warm, shining through the endless rows of spruce trees. The road was bad, full of grooves and soft mud, and the truck bounced hard the last few kilometers. When I finally arrived, I chose a flat spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been there for years. The trunk was rotting and soft, covered in moss. I set up my small tent, unpacked my gear, and boiled some water on my camping stove. The forest felt calm then. There was a steady breeze that carried the smell of pine needles, wet dirt, and the river not too far away. Even though I wanted peace, I kept feeling a strange sense of being watched. It wasn't anything loud or obvious, just that low, uncomfortable feeling you get when your body notices something before your mind does. I kept looking around, expecting to see a deer or something like that, but nothing moved. The forest was still except for the branches swaying gently above me. I tried to shake it off and enjoy the time alone. I ate, cleaned up, and sat on my cooler while the light faded. The forest became darker in layers, first turning blue, then fading into deeper shades until it became hard to see between the trees. I decided to go to bed early. I climbed into the tent and zipped it shut, leaving my boots outside on the ground. I woke up after midnight without knowing why. My heart was racing. The forest was silent in a way that felt wrong. There were no insects, no birds, no rustling, just stillness. I stayed on my back, staring at the top of the tent as my ears strained to pick up anything at all. Then I heard it, a slow, steady crunch of footsteps in the dirt and old needles. Not heavy like an animal, measured, careful, human. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the steps came again, slow and methodical, circling somewhere behind the tent. My body froze. I wasn't prepared for something like that. I had no weapon other than a small hatchet I used to chop firewood. The footsteps would stop, then start again, always staying just out of sight. I tried to breathe quietly, but my chest felt tight. I kept telling myself it could be a hiker or someone who got lost, but nobody would be out here in the middle of the night just walking around quietly like that. The area wasn't close to anything. Anyone wandering this far out would have a light, a voice, or some sign of being normal. But this person, if it was a person, moved slowly around my sight without making a sound except those careful steps. I felt trapped inside the tent. Every piece of me wanted to unzip it and run, but I also knew stepping outside might be worse. The sound stopped completely after a while. I didn't hear anything for what felt like a long time. I stayed awake until the first signs of light touched the fabric of the tent. My body felt stiff, like I hadn't moved all night. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My boots were gone. They weren't knocked over. They weren't a few feet away. They were simply not there. The ground around the tent showed faint marks. Someone or something had stood close, very close. The prints weren't clear because the ground was soft, but they weren't the shape of hooves or paws. They looked more like the shallow marks of someone stepping lightly, trying not to leave a trail. I looked around in every direction, but the forest was empty. No tracks leading away, no hint of where my boots could have gone. I searched for almost an hour until my feet were numb from the cold ground. Losing gear in the woods wasn't unusual, but boots don't just vanish overnight. It bothered me more than I could explain. It felt intentional. I stayed close to camp that entire day because something about wandering deeper into those trees felt wrong. I kept feeling watched again, the same quiet pressure from the night before. I tried to keep myself busy, collecting wood, boiling water, checking my map, anything to keep my mind balanced. Late in the afternoon, while I was bent over filling a water bottle at the river, I noticed something standing far up along the tree line. At first I thought it was a dead tree stump, tall and narrow, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. It wasn't shaped like a stump. It had a narrow top and a wide bottom, almost like a person standing very still. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't know if it stepped behind something or if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it felt real. My chest tightened again. I grabbed my bottle and walked back toward camp faster than before. That night, I didn't sleep at all. As the forest darkened again, that silence returned, pressing down around my tent like a heavy blanket. Sometime past midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were much closer, slow and steady, circling the exact same way as the night before. I could hear breathing, not loud, but real. A faint, controlled inhale and exhale just outside the thin layer of nylon that separated me from whoever was out there. I didn't move a muscle. I just lay there, completely rigid, praying that the tent wouldn't shake or that the zipper wouldn't pull down. The footsteps stopped right behind my head. I felt something gently touch the tent wall. Not pushing, not pulling, just a slow drag of a finger or maybe a stick tracing the shape of the fabric. It moved along the back of the tent, like someone was outlining it, learning its shape. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I would throw up. I forced myself not to make a sound. Eventually, after a long stretch of silence, I heard the footsteps fade slowly into the woods. Not running, not stumbling, just calm, careful steps moving gradually away until they disappeared. When the sky finally grew light again, I crawled out of the tent and found a second thing missing. My cooler. It hadn't been dragged or scattered by an animal. It was gone completely. No tracks, no signs of where it had been taken. Everything about it felt deliberate, almost like someone wanted me to know they had been close enough to take something large without waking me. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't relax. I didn't even eat. I threw everything I had left into the truck and left the campsite in under 10 minutes, barely checking the ground again. The forest felt different now, no longer quiet but heavy, like every tree was leaning in. When I finally reached the paved road, my shoulders dropped for the first time in 2 days. My hands were shaking so much I could barely keep the wheel straight. I didn't stop until I reached the town an hour away, and even then I sat in the parking lot of a gas station for a long time, trying to process everything. I returned home and told no one the full story. I only said the trip was cold and too quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about how the footsteps sounded, how the breathing felt against the tent, how my boots and cooler disappeared without a trace. I've camped many times since, but never alone. I can handle storms, animals, long hikes, and rough nights, but I can't handle the idea of someone wandering silently around my tent for hours, studying everything, waiting, touching the walls while I lay awake pretending to be asleep, too afraid to breathe. Whatever or whoever was out there those 2 nights wasn't lost, wasn't confused, and wasn't harmless. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew I was there. I had always been drawn to the idea of the Amazon, the stories, the raw energy of it, the way the forest seemed alive even from photographs. In 2018, when I was 27, I decided to finally experience it myself. My name is Lucas, and I had saved for months for this trip. I landed in Manaus in the early hours of a damp morning, the airport feeling like a transition point into another world. From there, I arranged a small motorboat with a local guide to take me deeper into the forest. The plan was simple: a week alone, camping along the tributaries, recording wildlife, photographing plants, and testing my own endurance. By the 3rd day, I was already immersed. The air was thick and humid, pressing against my skin, mixing with the earthy smell of damp leaves and the occasional sharp scent of decay from fallen fruit. I had learned quickly to move silently, to avoid startling the myriad creatures whose eyes glinted like tiny lanterns at night. I made camp on a narrow stretch of riverbank that curved around a small bend. The water was black but clear enough to reflect the canopy like a mirror. I set up my tent on a slight rise, just above the reach of the occasional flood, and cleared an area around it. The first night was restless. The forest had a language I was only beginning to understand. The hum of insects, the distant calls of birds, the splash of something large moving in the river. Sleep was intermittent. I woke to the sound of cracking branches, thinking it might be monkeys, but the cadence was too slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. Then I heard it. A wet, scraping noise against the bark of a tree, followed by a rustle as if something heavy was moving just beyond the edge of the small clearing I had made. My heart pounded, but I convinced myself it was a jaguar or maybe a tapir, but that reassurance didn't make it easier to breathe. The following day, I decided to explore further upstream. I hiked along the bank, using a machete to cut away thick vines, my boots sinking slightly into the mud with every step. The forest was so dense it seemed to press in on all sides. I was careful to mark my path with small chalk marks on tree trunks, but by the time I reached a small tributary, I realized I had underestimated how quickly the terrain could shift. The river split in a way I hadn't expected, and the dense foliage swallowed any line of sight. I stopped, listened, and noticed something odd. The usual ambient sounds of the forest, birds, insects, monkeys, were subdued here. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural. I set up a temporary camp beside the tributary. My stomach churned, a mix of hunger and unease. The sun was already low, and the shadows of the forest stretched like fingers across the water. I tried to ignore the gnawing anxiety building in my chest. At night, I heard it again. Not a roar, not a growl, something else. Something moving through the underbrush with immense patience, like it was studying me, learning my movements. I kept my flashlight aimed toward the sound, catching glimpses of something large. Its fur dark, wet, almost blending into the shadows. It didn't make a sound, not even a footstep, but I knew it was there. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close my eyes. The next morning, I broke camp and returned to my original site. I needed safety, familiarity. When I arrived, I noticed subtle signs I had missed before. Broken branches at waist height, deep scratches on the mud near my tent, footprints that weren't human. My heart sank. Whatever had been following me had studied my movements, likely for days. I decided to leave immediately, taking only what I could carry, moving slowly but deliberately toward the river where my boat awaited. By late afternoon, I reached a wide curve in the river where the current slowed. That's when it happened. A large capybara, a common animal usually docile, wasn't alone. This entire group, dozens of them, seemed tense, and I realized too late why. Across the riverbank, partially hidden by the shadows, a massive jaguar crouched low, muscles tensed, eyes locked on the animals. It noticed me too, and for the first time, I saw the raw, predatory intelligence of a wild predator in its natural environment. It was not hunting me, but the way it watched me, considering me without fear or hesitation, made me understand that I was now part of the forest's living calculation. I held my breath, slowly backing into the river. The boat was just a few meters away, and I pushed off with a stick. The jaguar didn't pursue immediately, but I didn't stop rowing until the bank was out of sight. My muscles burned, my heart raced, and sweat mixed with the river's water on my skin. By the time I reached a safe docking point hours later, my hands were shaking, and my mind was buzzing with the realization of how close I had come. The next few days were a blur of careful movement. I avoided dense areas, stayed close to the water, and moved only in daylight. The forest, which had seemed alive in a way that thrilled me, now felt like a maze designed to test endurance, alertness, and respect. I saw jaguars, caimans, and countless other creatures, but I avoided drawing attention. I kept my food secured, my camp minimal, and I slept in small bursts. By the sixth day, I finally reached a small village along the river where I could rest, resupply, and reflect. The local people shared tips about the animals' habits, explaining what I had experienced. They told me that the jaguar's territory was unusually close to the river this year, likely because of flooding upstream. It was a simple, ecological reason, but it didn't lessen the terror I had felt. When I finally returned to Manaus, exhausted but alive, I realized how raw and unforgiving the Amazon truly was. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't ghostly. It was alive, vast, and indifferent to human presence. My fear had been real, my danger real, and my survival depended on understanding the forest and respecting its laws. I had planned a week of adventure, but I had gained something else entirely. A humbling awareness of how fragile human safety is in a wild, untamed environment. Back home, I looked at my photos and recordings with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The images of dense foliage, reflective rivers, and fleeting glimpses of wildlife felt distant, almost unreal. But I remembered every moment of tension, every cautious step, and every heartbeat in the night. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been profoundly alive. I had entered the Amazon as an observer and emerged with a deeper understanding of the forest's pulse, its patience, and its absolute indifference. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I can hear the faint hum of the insects, the distant splash of the river, and the subtle rustle in the underbrush that made me realize how very small I was in a place that had existed long before me and would continue long after. The fear, the beauty, and the raw intensity of that week are etched into me, a reminder that the world is wider, stranger, and far more alive than most of us ever understand. It was the summer of 2019, and I had decided to go camping in the remote parts of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. I was 28 and I had been backpacking before, but this trip was supposed to be different. Completely alone, no one around for miles. I had mapped out a spot near a small hidden lake, far off the main trails. The forest was dense, mostly pine and fir, with patches of thick underbrush, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and resin. I drove up from Boise in my old Jeep Cherokee, the kind that rattled on rough roads and sounded like it might fall apart at any moment. I arrived around mid-afternoon, the sun high but beginning to tilt toward the west. I parked at the edge of a dirt path that led into the trees, unloaded my backpack, and started hiking toward the lake. The path was overgrown in places, roots and rocks jutting out like small obstacles meant to slow me down. I could hear the occasional call of a bird, a woodpecker knocking somewhere deep in the forest, but otherwise, the place felt silent, untouched. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. After almost 2 hours of hiking, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, a quiet, oval-shaped pool of water reflecting the green of the trees around it. There was a small clearing on its northern bank, perfect for setting up a tent. I dropped my pack and started unpacking my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, some canned food, and a first aid kit. I made a small fire pit with stones I found nearby and stacked some dry wood for later. The place was beautiful, almost serene, but there was an edge to it, an underlying tension in the stillness. As the sun began to set, the forest transformed. Shadows grew longer and the air cooled rapidly. I started a fire and cooked a small dinner of beans and rice. The smoke curled up into the air, and I thought about how quiet it was. So quiet that the sound of my own chewing seemed loud. By 9 o'clock, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I crawled into my tent. I had a headlamp and my phone, though I had no signal. The forest was alive in subtle ways. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping under the weight of small animals, the occasional splash from the lake. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was a rhythmic crunching, like someone walking on dry leaves, moving closer and closer to my tent. My heart started pounding. I lay flat on my back, trying not to make a sound, listening. The steps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then there was a low growl, very faint but definitely there. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion, or something else. I had my bear spray in the tent and my small folding knife, but nothing else. I stayed still for what felt like forever, until finally the sounds faded. When I peeked out, I saw nothing, just the shadows of trees under the moonlight, the lake shimmering quietly. I told myself it was probably a bear passing through, looking for food. I tried to calm down, but I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made me jump. The next morning, I packed up quickly, still shaken, and decided to move to a different part of the lake, hoping to feel safer. As I walked, I noticed strange tracks in the mud near the water's edge. Human-like, but larger than mine, and the toes were uneven. The prints were fresh, maybe a few hours old. My stomach sank. Someone had been here in the middle of the night, walking near the lake, and I had no idea who or why. I spent the day trying to distract myself, exploring the woods carefully, always keeping the lake in sight. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a strange smell, like smoke mixed with something metallic. I followed it cautiously, trying to locate the source without drawing attention to myself. About 50 yards from the lake, I found a small campsite newly abandoned. A torn tarp flapped in the wind, some scattered food wrappers, a half-burned fire. Whoever had been here was gone, but the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the forest seemed quieter than before. I returned to my tent, moving slowly, constantly scanning my surroundings. By evening, I had decided I needed to stay alert. I set up my tent closer to the trees for cover and built a fire that I kept burning higher than usual. I cooked a simple meal, trying to ignore the fear that had settled into my chest. Darkness came quickly. Around 10 p.m., I was woken again, this time by something different. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight, followed by the sound of footsteps, fast, running around the perimeter of my campsite. I grabbed my bear spray and crawled to the edge of the tent, peering out. I saw nothing at first, just the flickering shadows from my fire. Then movement, something darting behind a tree. It wasn't a bear. It was too deliberate, too quiet, too human-like. My pulse was racing. I realized the only option was to leave, even if it was dark. I grabbed my backpack, extinguished the fire as best I could, and moved toward the path I had come in on. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness. Every sound made me jump. I could hear branches snapping behind me, then nothing, then again. It was as if whoever or whatever was there was following, but always just out of sight. The hike back to my Jeep took longer than I expected. I kept checking behind me, but I never saw anyone. I stayed quiet, moving as fast as the uneven trail allowed. My legs burned, my lungs burned, but I kept going. Around 1 a.m., I finally stumbled back onto the dirt road where I had parked. I got into my Jeep, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a long time before starting the engine. The drive down the winding forest road was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. By the time I reached the main highway and had cell service again, I called the local ranger station to report what I had seen. Tracks, the abandoned campsite, the sounds at night. They told me that there had been reports of people illegally camping and sometimes harassing solo campers, but nothing serious had ever happened. They suggested sticking to more traffic trails in the future. I listened politely, but inside, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The experience left a mark on me. I went back to camping later, but I always stayed near other people or in designated campsites. I still remember the cold fear in the tent, the way the forest could feel so peaceful and then suddenly turn threatening. I learned that the wilderness can be unpredictable, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of other humans and the raw, uncontrollable power of nature itself. That trip changed how I approached the outdoors. I never underestimate isolation again. I carry extra gear, let someone know exactly where I'm going, and I trust my instincts in the woods more than any map. And sometimes, when I think about that night near the lake, I can still hear the faint snap of a branch, the crunch of footsteps, and I know how thin the line can be between adventure and danger. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2019, far from the small town of Montvale in Northern Virginia. I had been stressed for months, and the idea of spending a weekend away from everything felt like the only thing that could clear my head. I picked a remote patch of forest I had found on a topographic map, a place without campsites, without marked trails, without anything except trees, muddy ground, and silence. It seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a bit. I arrived early in the afternoon. The sky washed in a pale, dull blue that made everything look slightly faded. The heat clung to the air in a heavy, sticky way, and even the breeze felt warm. My backpack dug hard into my shoulders as I hiked deeper into the woods. The trail I followed at first slowly thinned out and faded into the underbrush. Soon, I was stepping over fallen logs, pushing branches aside, and moving mostly by instinct. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and my boots made muffled prints in the damp soil. I didn't see a single person or even hear distant traffic. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the world behind me dissolved. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall oaks and thick ferns. It felt hidden enough that nobody would stumble across it by accident. The sun was still high, and I had plenty of time to set up my tent. I placed it near a fallen tree that looked like it had been dead for years, its bark stripped off by weather and insects. The ground there was flat, and I hammered the stakes in until they felt secure. Then I gathered some fallen branches for a small fire. The humidity clung to everything, so I wasn't sure the fire would take. But after enough attempts, the kindling caught and a thin flame grew. As the sun lowered, the air cooled a little. The forest around me became darker much faster than the sky. The tall canopy blocked most of the remaining light, and the shadows thickened into shapes that stretched across the clearing. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and listened to the sounds around me. Crickets, small rustles in the leaves, the occasional soft thump of something dropping from a tree. Everything felt normal, peaceful, almost predictable. The forest had that natural rhythm you settle into once you've been in it long enough. But as the first real stretch of night arrived, that rhythm changed. I couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't one specific sound or movement. It was the absence of something. The forest felt emptied out. The insects that had been buzzing and chirping went quiet as if someone had shut off a switch. The silence thickened until I could hear my own heartbeat inside my ears. Even the breeze seemed to pause. The stillness became heavy, pressing down on me in a way that felt unnatural, even though I kept telling myself there was nothing supernatural about it. Just nature being unpredictable. The fire crackled softly, and its glow made the darkness beyond the clearing look even darker. While staring into the trees, I started to feel watched. Not in a paranoid, imagined way. More like the same sensation you get when someone stands behind you without making a sound. Crawled across the back of my neck, sinking into my shoulders. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling stayed. I forced myself to stay calm. I checked the area around the clearing, moving slowly and making sure I didn't step too far from the light of the fire. The beams of my flashlight caught only trees, branches, and scattered leaves. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. The fear didn't really come until I noticed the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints, human footprints. They were pressed into the soft soil near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by some fallen leaves. They weren't mine. Mine were deeper and spaced differently. These were lighter, newer, and facing directly toward my campsite. I stared at them longer than I should have. They looked like they had been made within the last few hours, maybe even more recent than that. My chest tightened. I scanned the trees again, trying to spot any movement, but the forest remained still. I kept telling myself they could have belonged to someone who passed through earlier in the day. A hiker, a hunter, anyone. But the silence around me didn't support that comforting lie. It felt wrong again, like a thick blanket placed over sound. I backed toward the tent, grabbing my small hatchet from beside the fire. Even with it in my hand, my grip felt weak. The firelight flickered, and shadows reached across the clearing like long fingers stretching from every direction. I sat down near the tent, trying to stay alert. The seconds dragged into minutes, and the minutes dragged into what felt like hours. My eyes kept darting from tree to tree, my ears straining for any sound at all. Finally came a slow, careful step, then another. They came from somewhere in the darkness behind the ferns. The steps were spaced too far apart to be a small animal. The weight of each one pressed lightly into the ground, controlled, almost cautious. Someone was out there, moving with intention, moving in a way that felt practiced. The part of the evening that scared me the most wasn't the sound itself. It was the fact that whoever was out there stopped moving as soon as I turned my flashlight toward the area. The beam slid across trees, leaves, and bushes, but nothing shifted. Nothing reacted. But the silence that followed felt sharper, like whoever was watching realized I knew. I stayed awake the whole night. I didn't go into the tent. I kept the fire alive, feeding it every time it started to shrink. I sat with my back against my backpack so nothing could approach me from behind. My legs ached, my eyes burned, and my thoughts kept running in circles. Every few minutes I thought I heard something, a soft shuffle, a faint breath of movement, a distant crack of a stick, but I couldn't be sure if any of it was real or just my nerves breaking down. When the sky finally began to lighten, the forest slowly returned to life. Birds started making soft calls. The breeze picked up again, brushing through the branches in a gentle rhythm. The normal sounds I had missed came back one by one. It felt like the world was exhaling, waking up from something it didn't want to acknowledge. With the daylight giving me strength, I walked toward the area where I had heard the steps. The moss and leaves were disturbed. Fresh impressions marked the ground, more footprints, clearer this time. They circled part of the clearing and stopped only a few meters from where I had been sitting all night. Whoever had been out there had stood close enough to see every move I made. The weight of that hit me harder than anything else. I didn't waste time packing. I shoved everything into my backpack, even things that didn't fit properly, and left the tent staked down because taking it apart would have taken too long. I followed the same path I had come from, walking fast, sometimes jogging, constantly checking behind me. The forest looked normal again, but the feeling never lifted. I didn't slow down until I reached my car. When I finally drove back toward town, the relief didn't hit me all at once. It came in small waves, each one settling deeper as the distance grew between me and that clearing. By the time I reached Montvale, the sun was bright, the roads were busy, and the world felt grounded again. But even then, a part of me stayed tense. In the days after, I kept thinking about the footprints. They weren't old. They weren't passing through. They were watching. Someone had been out there in the dark woods, silent, patient, waiting only a few steps beyond the light where I couldn't see them. If I had fallen asleep or gone inside the tent, I don't know what would have happened. I never went back to that forest. I never even tried camping alone again. Every time I think about it, I can still picture the shape of those footprints in the soft soil, each one pointed straight toward me, each one a reminder that the scariest thing out there wasn't any creature or story, just another person who stayed hidden in the night, too close, too quiet, and for reasons I'll never understand. And that was enough to change the way I see the woods forever. planned the camping trip for months. It was the summer of 2021, and I had just turned 26, old enough to be responsible but still young enough to want the kind of quiet that only comes from being alone in a place far away from busy roads and crowded towns. I picked a remote spot in Northumberland, near an old forest not far from the Cheviot Hills. It wasn't some famous campsite with people and cars and noise. It was just a wild patch of land that hikers sometimes passed, but most people ignored. That was exactly why I chose it. I wanted to sit with the trees, the cold air, and the long stretches of silence that felt heavier than anything I knew back home in Leeds. I packed everything the night before: my tent, my old sleeping bag, a small stove, extra batteries, a headlamp, a knife that I only ever used for cooking, and a notebook I planned to fill with sketches of the landscape. I left early in the morning and reached the trail by noon. The weather was strange that day. It wasn't stormy, but there was a heaviness in the air, the kind that made the wind move slowly through the tall grass. The sky stayed gray and flat, like it couldn't choose whether it wanted to brighten or darken. I walked about 2 hours into the forest, moving deeper than I originally planned because everything looked peaceful and untouched, like time had passed through the trees without altering anything. By the time the sun started sinking behind the hills, I had found a clearing beside a line of tall, thin pines. The ground was soft, covered in dry needles, and there was a spot where the trees curved away just enough to make room for a tent. I set everything up the way I always did. Stakes pushed deep, guy lines tight, sleeping bag fluffed out, food stored away from where I'd sleep. Everything felt fine. Everything felt normal. But normal is always temporary. After I set up camp, I walked a little way past the clearing to stretch my legs. The forest was quiet in the kind of way that felt too strong for comfort. I kept listening for small sounds, birds, insects, anything, but I heard almost nothing. Only my footsteps and the distant wind brushing the tops of the trees. I stayed out for about an hour before heading back to camp. I boiled some water for noodles and sat on a log while eating, the air around me slowly cooling. That was when I first noticed something strange. Across from my clearing, maybe 70 or 80 meters away, the pine trees grew very close together, forming dark clusters between the trunks. I wasn't looking for anything, but my eyes kept drifting to a particular spot between two trees. At first, I thought I imagined it, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that something was standing there. A shape, tall, still, human. I froze and tried to make sense of it. It didn't move. It didn't tilt or breathe or shift. It was just standing there, as if watching me. I blinked hard, thinking it was only a shadow or the way the branches lined up. But the shape didn't vanish. It didn't soften or blur the way illusions usually do. It stayed the exact same height and size, fixed in the gap between the trunks. My mind tried to make excuses. Maybe it was a tree stump. Maybe someone had cut wood there, and the leftover trunk happened to look like a person at the right angle. Maybe the stress of the day made me see something that wasn't real. I forced myself to look away and focus on finishing my meal. When I looked back again later, the shape was gone. I tried to tell myself it must have been nothing, a trick of the light, a trick of my mind. I kept thinking that, repeating it until I started to believe it, but the feeling didn't go away. By the time the sky turned dark, the forest felt different. The wind stopped completely, letting every sound inside the trees sharpen and stretch out. I sat near the tent with my small lantern glowing weakly beside me, writing a few things in my notebook. But I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the tree line, searching for that shape again. It didn't appear, but the unease stayed. I eventually crawled into the tent. The air inside was warm from my body heat, and the thin smell of nylon mixed with the faint scent of pine from outside. I zipped the tent shut and lay down, listening to the distant creaks of the forest settling for the night. It took a long time before my eyes grew heavy. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up with a jolt. At first, I didn't understand why. My heart was pounding, and there was a pressure in my chest like I had been holding my breath. I lifted my head slightly, listening. There was a sound outside my tent. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was slow, very slow, like steady, cautious footsteps pressing into the pine needles. Not the light tapping of an animal, not the fast scurrying of something small. These steps were too deliberate, too heavy, too human. They stopped right outside my tent. I lay completely still, my breathing shallow and forced. The air became thick, and every muscle in my body tensed. I could hear the soft, measured shifting of weight, like someone was standing just inches from the thin fabric that separated us. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened, my ears straining to pick up any hint of what was happening. Then I heard it, a slow drag of something soft across the tent wall. Not a hand, not a branch, more like fabric brushing against the nylon. Someone was leaning over my tent. My stomach dropped, turning cold in a way I had never felt before. I didn't know if the person was crouching, standing, or bending close to listen. I only knew they were too close, so close that I could hear their quiet shifting, like they were adjusting their weight with careful intention. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time felt stretched and warped. Then the sound moved again, this time circling around the back of the tent. I tracked each step with my breath trapped in my throat. The footsteps were slow, as if whoever it was wanted to avoid making noise. They stopped again right near the zipper. I waited for the sound of the zipper being pulled. It never came. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the steps began moving away. Not through the clearing, but toward the dense trees opposite me, the same cluster where I'd seen the shape earlier. The steps faded slowly until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake until morning, gripping my small camping knife, my mind racing with every possible explanation. When the first light filled the clearing, I unzipped the tent with shaking hands. The forest was calm again, almost peaceful, but the ground told the truth. I saw the prints, long, narrow footprints pressed clearly into the needles. Human footprints. Someone had walked around my tent in the middle of the night, stopping at every side, lingering long enough to leave deeper impressions in the dirt. I didn't even pack my things properly. I just shoved everything into my bag, tore down the tent, and started hiking back toward the trail as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone stepping out from behind the trees. But the forest stayed still. When I finally reached my car, I felt the kind of relief that shakes your entire body. I drove until the forest was far behind me, and only stopped once I reached a busy petrol station. I never went back to that area again. I never tried to find out who that man was or why he was watching me. I didn't want answers. Some things don't need answers. Some things should stay in the dark place where you left them. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about how silent the forest was, how still that shape stood, how slow those footsteps moved around my tent, and how easily something could have happened if I hadn't woken up at the right moment. Real danger doesn't always jump out or scream or scratch. Sometimes it simply watches. Sometimes it waits, and sometimes you don't realize how close it came until long after you've escaped it. That night taught me something I never forgot. You don't need ghosts to be scared. Sometimes a real human is more than enough. I had been driving for almost 10 hours when I finally pulled into the small dirt clearing that the old map on my phone called a primitive campsite. It was deep in northern Arizona, far from towns, far from the big highways, far from everything I was used to. I had taken a week off work to clear my head, convinced that being alone in the quiet would help me stop thinking about the useless noise of my life. I was 31, tired from months of sitting in front of screens, and I felt like I had forgotten what real silence sounded like. The campsite was nothing more than a patch of dry earth between tall pines. The forest looked darker than any place I had ever been. The sun was still up, but the shade under the trees was thick like a heavy curtain. The air smelled of resin, dust, and dry grass. It was late June, but the wind still had a cold bite even before sunset. I parked my small rental car on the flattest part one could find. There were no other cars around, no tents, no trash, not even footprints. It felt as if no one had camped there for a long time. I told myself that was good. I had wanted isolation, and I had found it. I unpacked slowly, stretching my legs after hours of sitting. The forest had a strange stillness, like it was watching me. Every small sound, my boots scraping the dirt, the rustle of a plastic bag, the soft clink of metal stakes, seemed louder than it should have been. I set up my tent near a fallen tree trunk and laid out my sleeping bag, a lantern, and my small stove. Everything felt normal enough, but there was something about the silence that made my chest feel tight. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast. I cooked a small meal and ate while sitting on the trunk. Behind me, the forest stretched endlessly, the trees forming dark shapes as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Coyotes started calling somewhere far away, their cries echoing through the hills. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I kept reminding myself that I was alone, and that was exactly what I wanted. When night finally settled, it came down hard. Without city lights, the darkness felt alive. My lantern cast a soft circle around the tent, but the space beyond it was pitch black. I sat inside the tent with the lantern turned low, trying to read a book, but my mind kept drifting to every tiny sound outside. Twigs snapping, leaves moving, wind brushing through the branches overhead. I knew all of it was normal, but in that silence, the smallest noise felt sharp and threatening. A little before midnight, the wind stopped completely. The air turned still and heavy. That was when I heard the first clear sound, something moving through the brush behind my tent. The steps were slow and heavy, not like an animal that moved quickly or nervously. It sounded deliberate. I froze, staring at the thin tent fabric as if I could see through it. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel each beat in my throat. For a few seconds, the footsteps stopped. The forest became silent again, too silent, as if holding its breath. I thought maybe it was just a deer or an elk, but something about the weight and slowness of the steps didn't match. I sat perfectly still, listening for anything. Then the footsteps started again, this time even closer, brushing through the tall grass right behind where my head rested. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. I kept my breath shallow, forcing myself not to panic. After almost a full minute, the steps faded. Whatever it was moved away into the darkness. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to breathe normally. My hands were shaking as I turned off the lantern and lay down. I told myself it was wildlife, nothing more. But I didn't sleep, not even a little. Hours passed like that, staring upward at the dim outline of the ceiling, counting every second, waiting for daylight. My eyes felt dry and strained. My ears felt too alert, listening for the slightest sound. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something again, but it wasn't steps this time. It was a faint metal click, like something tapping against the side of my car. Once, then again. I felt a wave of cold rush through my chest. I didn't move. I listened. Another click, softer this time, like someone running a finger across the handle of the car door. I knew that animals didn't do that. Not like that. Not with slow, careful pressure. It was the kind of sound a person made when checking if the door was locked. I lay there frozen, every muscle tight. My heart beat so loud that I feared it would give me away. The car was only a few feet from the tent. If someone was out there, They were close enough to hear me breathing. I wished the tent had been thicker, wished I had parked closer, wished I had never chosen this spot. The clicking stopped. The forest fell silent again. I waited. Minutes passed with nothing but the sound of my pulse in my ears. Then I heard something much worse, soft steps circling the tent. Not hurried, just slow, measured, like someone studying the shape of it. The hair on my arms stood straight up. I couldn't do anything but stay silent. I had no weapon. My phone had no signal. The tent felt like a thin paper shell between me and whoever was out there. The steps paused right beside my head. I imagined a figure standing just inches away, staring down at the fabric, listening. My throat was dry. My body was shaking without my control, but I tried my hardest to stay still. After several long moments, the steps moved again, this time toward the front of the tent. I could hear the gentle crunch of dry needles under the weight of each step. A shadow passed across the faint moonlight leaking through the material. Then everything stopped again. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. Nothing moved. Nothing touched the tent again. Eventually I realized the person, if it was a person, had walked away. But I didn't sleep after that. I didn't even unclench my fists. I just lay there in that cold, wet fear, waiting for morning. When the first gray light finally appeared, it felt like the whole world let out a breath. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside, my legs unsteady. The air was cold, but the relief of daylight was enough to warm me. I checked around the clearing. The dirt was disturbed near my car, and the thin layer of dust on the windows showed smudges. Long, thin streaks where something had dragged across the glass. I followed the marks around the car and stopped when I saw the small, clear imprint of a boot heel in the dirt. It wasn't old. The edges were sharp, like it had been made only hours before. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into the car as fast as I could. My hands were still trembling when I started the engine. I backed out of the clearing and drove down the rough road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly 50 miles away. Only then, in full daylight, surrounded by people and noise and the sound of cars, did the shaking finally stop. I had wanted silence, but I learned that silence wasn't peaceful when you were alone in the dark with someone you didn't know. I never found out who was at the campsite that night or what they wanted. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there, watching me in the dark, checking my car door, circling my tent while I lay inside unable to move. It was real, all of it, and I never camped alone again. It was early September in the Adirondack Mountains, about 2:30 in the afternoon, when I arrived at the campsite. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long, lazy shadows across the trail. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. Just me, the wilderness, and a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. I was 29, not exactly an expert at camping, but comfortable enough with it. I had all the gear I needed: a tent, a small stove, sleeping bag, and enough food for the weekend. The hike to the campsite wasn't particularly difficult, but it was long enough to make me feel like I had earned the rest. The air had that crisp, fresh mountain scent, the kind that makes you feel alive. I was looking forward to setting up my tent and just being alone with nature for a few days. The spot I chose was tucked away behind a stand of tall pines near a stream. It wasn't too far from the trail, but far enough that I wouldn't hear anyone passing by. I set my pack down beside a boulder, feeling the familiar mix of satisfaction and exhaustion that comes with a hike like this. It was a perfect spot, secluded, peaceful, and not a soul in sight. I began setting up my tent, taking my time. I wasn't in any hurry. By the time I finished, The sun had dipped lower in the sky, painting the clouds in streaks of purple and orange. It wasn't quite dusk yet, but I knew I should start thinking about dinner. I cooked a simple meal of pasta, nothing fancy, just something to fill me up after the hike. The silence around me was almost deafening, broken only by the distant rush of the stream and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. As I ate, I felt a strange sense of unease, a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the typical scared of the dark feeling, more like the sensation that I wasn't entirely alone, that someone or something was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia, reminding myself that I was just tired from the hike. Once I finished eating, I cleaned up, stowed my food away in a bear-proof container, and started a small campfire. The night air was cooling quickly, and the warmth from the fire felt good. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, letting my thoughts drift. The peace of the moment was almost meditative, and the last remnants of unease started to fade. That's when I heard it. A soft crackling sound from the woods behind me, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stiffened, my heart rate picking up. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but then the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't a simple rustling of leaves. It was something heavier, more deliberate. Someone or something was moving around out there. I froze, straining my ears to listen. I couldn't hear any footsteps, but I could still feel the weight of whatever it was, just outside of my sight. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone else looking for a campsite. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The noise didn't stop, and it felt wrong. It was too calculated, too intentional. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the edge of the forest. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I swung it back and forth, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone. Maybe it was just an animal after all. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure standing still just beyond the trees, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My pulse raced. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or if I'd actually seen something, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just waiting, watching me. I tried to push it out of my mind and turned back to the fire, but the unease only grew stronger. I pulled my backpack closer to me and sat back down, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire and the soothing crackle of the burning wood. The night pressed on, and eventually, I forced myself to settle down in my tent. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone in the wilderness, and the mind can play tricks when it's isolated like that. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, the sounds from the forest kept gnawing at me. The crackling noises, the occasional snap of a twig, the feeling of eyes on my back. It all kept me wide awake, even though I tried to shut it out. Around midnight, I heard a sharp, distinct noise, a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen in the woods. My body tensed. I waited, straining to listen. The sound wasn't repeated, but the air felt heavier, like it was filled with static. I grabbed my flashlight again, shining it out through the mesh of the tent. My pulse thudded in my ears as I scanned the area. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That sense of being watched, of something just beyond the firelight, continued to grow stronger. I stayed still, listening to the quiet, waiting for the next sound. But it never came. After what felt like an eternity, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie stillness. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something was wrong. My mind raced as I tried to shake off the remnants of my uneasy dreams. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, squinting against the bright morning sunlight. The campsite was just as I had left it, but the woods, they felt different. There was something off about them, a quiet that was too quiet. The birds weren't chirping, and the wind had stopped. As I made breakfast, I glanced around, trying to spot any signs of who or what had been out there last night. My eyes landed on something strange near the edge of the woods. A set of footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human-sized, but uneven, like someone had been walking, stumbling through the brush. The tracks led from the woods, passed by my tent, and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't need to follow them to know that they weren't mine. The realization hit me like a cold wave. There had been someone here last night, someone who had watched me from the woods, and now they were gone. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack. I didn't even stop to take in the beauty of the place one last time. My heart pounded in my chest as I hiked back down the trail, my eyes darting to every shadow in the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where a few cars were parked, their owners having already left for the day. It wasn't until I was back in my car, safe and sound, that the tension in my shoulders finally eased. But I couldn't shake the memory of those footprints or the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if it was a person or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation of the wilderness. But I do know this: I haven't been camping since, and if I ever do decide to go again, I'll be a lot more careful about choosing my spot. Because in the woods, you're never truly alone. It was a late autumn night in 2017, somewhere deep in the wilds of the Welsh countryside, the kind of place where the roads are narrow and winding, and the forests feel ancient, as if they've been standing guard for centuries. I was 25 at the time, a bit of an adrenaline junkie who loved the outdoors, and this camping trip was supposed to be a solo adventure to get away from it all. I had taken time off from work and had rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The plan was simple: pitch my tent, light a fire, and just relax under the stars. Little did I know, the trip would soon turn into something I would never forget. The weather had been calm when I arrived in the afternoon. I set up camp quickly, eager to get settled before it got dark. The area was quiet, with nothing but the sound of rustling leaves and distant birds. The cabin was just a small, worn structure with an old wood-burning stove and a couple of old chairs. It had been uninhabited for some time, but it wasn't a place that worried me. It felt like the kind of place where a person could hide away from the world. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, a chill set in, and the clouds started to gather overhead. I didn't think much of it at first. I had a rain jacket and a couple of warm layers, so I figured I'd be fine. As the evening wore on, the air became heavy, and the distant rumblings of thunder grew louder. I was sitting by the fire, tossing a few more logs on, when the first drops of rain started to fall. First, it was just a light drizzle, the kind of rain that was easy to ignore, almost soothing. But it didn't take long before it picked up into a steady downpour, soaking everything in its path. The fire began to hiss and crackle as the rain splashed against the logs. I quickly moved into the cabin to wait it out, thinking it would pass soon enough. The storm didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow worse by the hour. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees and making the walls of the cabin creak in protest. By the time it was fully dark, the storm was relentless. Sheets of rain poured from the sky, and the wind tore through the forest like it was alive. The noise outside was deafening. Rain slamming against the roof, branches crashing together, and the occasional loud thunderclap that made the entire cabin shake. I had hoped the storm would die down after an hour or so, but it was now approaching midnight, and there was no sign of it letting up. The cabin felt colder with every passing minute. The fire in the stove had long since gone out, and I didn't feel like dealing with it in the rain. I curled up in the corner of the cabin under a blanket and tried to get some sleep, but the sound of the storm made it impossible to relax. The wind screamed and the rain slapped against the windows like it was trying to get in. Then, around 2 a.m., the noises outside changed. There was something else in the air, something strange that made my spine tingle. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the atmosphere felt wrong. The wind had shifted direction, and now it sounded like it was coming from the opposite side of the cabin. The trees outside, which had been swaying heavily before, suddenly went still. The silence that followed felt unnerving, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I heard something, a faint thudding noise, almost like footsteps. They were slow at first, deliberate, and it didn't take long to realize they weren't coming from the path leading to the cabin. They were coming from the woods behind me, where the trees were thick and dark. I tried to brush it off as an animal or the wind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The footsteps continued for a few minutes, getting closer and closer. It wasn't the casual, random rhythm of someone just walking through the woods. These were heavy, measured steps, the kind that made the ground thud with each footfall. Whoever or whatever was out there was pacing, like it was waiting for something or someone. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing, and peered through the cabin's foggy windows. The storm made it hard to see anything clearly, but I could make out a shape in the darkness. A figure standing perfectly still, not far from the edge of the trees. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the downpour, staring at the cabin. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its presence as if it were staring straight into me, watching me with intent. My mind raced as I thought of all the possible explanations. Maybe it was another camper, someone else who had gotten stuck in the storm and had wandered too far. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The figure hadn't moved, and something about the stillness of the night didn't sit right with me. No animal, no person could stand perfectly still in a downpour like that, especially not for so long. I stayed there, frozen, watching it, waiting for something to happen. The thudding steps stopped, but the figure remained in place. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breathing shallow. The flashlight trembled in my hands, and I had to fight the urge to run out and confront whatever it was. But I wasn't stupid. I'd seen enough horror movies to know better than to go out there. Whoever or whatever was out there clearly wasn't in any hurry. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished back into the trees, disappearing into the storm without a trace. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought it might burst. But I didn't move. I stayed crouched by the window, eyes glued to the dark. I had no intention of leaving the cabin, but my nerves were shot. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal or maybe someone else out there in the storm. But deep down, I knew what I had seen wasn't right. I didn't sleep that night. The rain continued to pour, but the figure never came back. Morning eventually arrived, and the storm began to subside. The forest was eerily quiet now, the calm after the chaos. I waited until the first light of day broke through the clouds before I stepped outside. I knew I had to check the area around the cabin just to be sure. I found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. The ground was muddy, but there was no trace of anyone having walked near the cabin. The trees around me stood silent and unmoving in the early morning light, as if nothing had happened. I packed up and left shortly after, not wanting to stick around any longer than I had to. I didn't know what I had seen that night, but I had a feeling that whatever it was, it hadn't been human. It left no trace, and it certainly didn't act like any creature I had ever encountered. I've never gone camping alone in the Welsh countryside again. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of my life and go camping. I needed some time away from the noise, from the demands, from everything. I was 25 at the time, and I had always loved the idea of escaping into the wild. I'd gone on hikes, day trips, but this was my first real camping experience. I picked a spot in the northern Arizona woods, a quiet place far from the nearest town. There were no tourist sites, no lodges, just trees, rocks, and silence. Perfect. I set off alone in my old Subaru, loaded with a tent, some camping gear, and enough food to last me a week. The drive took me through dusty, empty roads, a stretch of land with nothing but scrub brush and towering pines. The trees started to thin out as I reached my destination, a small campground that sat at the edge of a secluded forest area. I pitched my tent at the farthest corner, close to the trees, wanting to be as deep in the woods as possible. The sun was just beginning to set when I finished setting up. A chill was already creeping in, and the sky was turning dark. I spent the evening gathering firewood, and after a quick meal, I settled in front of the fire. The fire crackled and popped, the warmth of it contrasting with the cool air. There was no wind, just the sound of my own thoughts and the occasional rustle from the forest. I didn't think much about it at first, but there was something strange about the forest around me. It felt too still, like nature itself was holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I hadn't spent many nights alone in the wilderness, so it was probably just that. I checked my phone for signal, none. Good. I liked the isolation. Night fully settled in, and I climbed into my tent. The fire was still burning outside, and I could hear the occasional crackle of wood splitting. The forest had gone silent, though. I thought I heard something far off in the distance, maybe a coyote or some other animal, but I quickly dismissed it. I had never been particularly scared of the woods, and I wasn't about to let a few noises get to me now. I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking I heard someone walking outside my tent. The sound was faint, but it was there, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the trees. But the more I listened, the more uneasy I felt. The sounds weren't animal-like. The footsteps were too heavy, too rhythmic. I forced myself to stay still, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease crawling up my spine. The noises came and went, sometimes just outside my tent, sometimes farther away. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like a low whistle, almost human. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for the strange noises. I knew I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the forest. At some point, the noises stopped. Complete silence. I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a noise so close, it made me freeze in fear. I heard something tapping on the outside of my tent. It was light at first, almost like the brush of a hand. But then it became more insistent, louder, like something or someone was dragging their hand along the fabric. I lay there, motionless, barely able to breathe. I thought about calling out, but the fear that gripped me wouldn't let me. I didn't know if it was human or animal, but the way it moved, the way it lingered, didn't seem right. I listened for any more sounds, but it was as if the forest had closed in around me. The air felt thick, the kind of stillness that presses down on your chest. Then I heard it, a voice, a low, gravelly voice, whispering just outside the tent. "Come out." My heart nearly stopped. The voice sounded wrong, unnatural, like it was trying to mimic human speech but couldn't quite get it right. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like something pretending to be one. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed with fear, but somehow I managed to gather enough courage to grab my flashlight. I flicked it on and unzipped the tent, pointing the beam of light into the darkness outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, save for my campfire still burning faintly in the distance. I stood there for a few moments, waiting for something to appear, but nothing came. The silence was suffocating. I closed the tent quickly and locked it shut, my mind racing. I was alone. There was no one else around. But then why had I heard that voice? Why had I felt the presence of something just outside? It was only when I looked back at my tent that I saw the tracks. Deep, heavy footprints in the dirt, leading up to my tent and then vanishing into the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too human. I knew I had to leave. I packed up my things in a hurry, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The light from the fire illuminated the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I knew that whatever had been outside my tent wasn't gone. I made it to my car as quickly as I could, but when I turned the engine over, it sputtered. The damn thing wouldn't start. Panic gripped me again. I was trapped in the middle of nowhere, and whatever was out there, it knew I was alone. That's when I saw it. A figure in the trees, just beyond the light of my headlights. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against the dark forest. But I could feel its eyes on me. The figure stepped closer, and I could see it more clearly now. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its movements were jerky, like it didn't quite understand how to walk. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the way it moved, it wasn't human. The way its limbs bent at strange angles, the way its head tilted unnaturally. It was like something trying to mimic a person, but failing horribly. I slammed the car into reverse, and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my heart still pounding, my hands still shaking. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, and I never went back to that campground. What I saw that night, I believe, was a skinwalker. I don't know what it wanted or why it was following me, but I know it wasn't human. The forest was its domain, and I was just a trespasser. I haven't gone camping alone since then, and I doubt I ever will again. It was the fall of 2017 when my friends and I decided to camp on a quiet, isolated farm just outside of town. I was 23 at the time, still figuring out life, and was looking for a weekend getaway to unwind. We had heard about this farm from a friend of a friend who mentioned that the landowner, an old man named Earl, rented out his property to people looking for a rustic camping experience. The farm had been in Earl's family for generations, a patch of land that stretched for miles, nestled at the foot of some pretty rough-looking hills. We didn't think much of it when we first arrived, just a simple weekend plan. There were 4 of us in total, me, my best friend Noah, his girlfriend, Emma, and Luke, a guy I knew from college but wasn't particularly close to. We rolled up in Noah's old Jeep, throwing our bags and tents into the back as we parked by the small barn near the edge of the property. Earl greeted us in a way that didn't sit right with me. He was a tall, wiry old man, his face lined with deep wrinkles that seemed to map out 100 years of hard living. He didn't smile much, but he welcomed us and pointed us toward a spot behind the barn where we could set up camp. "Keep to yourselves, and don't wander past the woods," he said. "Ain't safe over there." That was all he said about it, then turned and walked off without another word. Felt weird, but we didn't think much of it at the time. It was an odd comment, sure, but we chalked it up to him being just a grumpy old farmer. The place was quiet, really quiet. No birds chirped, no animals in sight. Only the rustling of the trees as the wind blew through. Felt almost unnatural. After setting up our tents, we built a fire near the edge of the camp. cooking up hot dogs and talking about whatever came to mind. The evening started off peaceful enough, the fire crackling, the night settling in around us. But as the darkness deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had always been good at tuning out small stuff, the usual weird noises that come with camping. But this was different. Around 9 p.m., we heard something that I couldn't ignore. It started as a low, distant rumble, like thunder far away, but there were no clouds in the sky. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, like someone walking through the tall grass, but getting closer and closer. Every few seconds, they'd stop, as if someone was standing still, listening. I glanced at Noah, who was sitting next to me by the fire, and saw that he looked equally unsettled. The footsteps stopped for a while, then began again. Only this time it was closer, too close. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, we should check it out." I wasn't keen on going out into the dark woods, but curiosity got the better of me. We both grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the darkness where the sounds seemed to be coming from. The others stayed behind, too spooked to move. As we moved toward the edge of the woods, I felt that same uneasy sensation pressing down on me, like the air itself was thicker. My heart pounded in my chest. Something didn't sit right. The night had gotten colder, and I realized we hadn't even thought to grab jackets. I turned to look back at the campfire, but the light seemed so far away now, the shadows swallowing everything around us. The footsteps had stopped. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. The crunch of our boots against the dry leaves was the only sound now. "Where is it coming from?" I whispered to Noah, my voice barely above a breath. Noah didn't answer right away. He just kept scanning the trees, his flashlight darting back and forth across the trunks. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the darkness of his hood. He stood still, staring at us, but didn't move. I froze. Noah tensed beside me. We both stood there for a long moment, staring at this guy. Something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't dressed like a typical camper or hiker. He was wearing old, torn clothes, with patches of dirt and grime all over him. "Hey!" Noah called out, trying to sound casual. "Are you lost or something?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his back to a large oak tree. For a moment, I thought maybe he was just some local who wandered out here for whatever reason. But then, as the seconds stretched on, I realized that he wasn't moving. Not even a twitch. It was like he was waiting. "What the hell's going on?" I muttered under my breath. Noah was about to say something else when the man finally moved. But it wasn't normal. He didn't walk. He just jerked forward, his body stiff, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Without a word, Noah grabbed my arm and yanked me back toward the camp. We didn't stop to look back at the man, didn't even check if he was following us. We just ran, fast as we could, pushing through the underbrush, jumping over fallen branches, not stopping until we reached the firelight. Emma and Luke were sitting there, wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" Luke asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, panting. "Some guy, but he wasn't acting right." Noah looked at me, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." We all agreed, no one even hesitating. It wasn't until we started packing up our things that we realized the man had somehow followed us. When I looked toward the barn, I saw his figure standing at the edge of the camp, just watching. But this time he wasn't alone. There were more figures emerging from the darkness, all of them standing still, staring. I don't know how we managed it, but we got everything packed up and into the Jeep in record time. Noah floored it and we sped out of there, not looking back until we hit the main road. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. There were no more figures, just empty, dark farmland. but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. I don't know why Earl acted the way he did, or why he warned us to stay away from the woods. But I do know this: whatever we saw that night, whatever it was that followed us, it wasn't human. And I'll never camp on a farm again.